Welcome to Washington Today from Monday, July 24, 2023. I'm Gary Sterhoff. Thanks a lot for listening today. Lawmakers in the Israeli parliament have passed a controversial judicial reform bill that limits the ability of the nation's Supreme Court to strike down government actions. The move sparked mass protests across the country. We'll hear White House reaction coming up. Congress returns to work tomorrow. The House will consider its first 2024 spending bills, funding the Agriculture Department, the FDA, and the VA for next year. The Senate is expected to continue work on the annual defense programs and policy bill. And in campaign 2024 news, a former senator jumps into the governor's race in New Hampshire, and two new polls, one in Ohio that shows broad support for a constitutional amendment on reproductive rights, and one in Iowa that shows a possible second challenger to Donald Trump in the Republican presidential race.
מרב מיכאלי, בעד. מרב מיכאלי, נגד.
That's the final vote announcement in the Israeli Knesset earlier today as it approved Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's controversial judicial reform bill. And that's the sound of thousands of Israelis rallying outside the Knesset building as the vote took place, with some chaining themselves to the gates and blocking roads in an attempt to stop lawmakers from reaching the compound. The Washington Post described the scene as, quote, a dramatic parliamentary session with shouts of shame chanted by demonstrators outside the Knesset and by opposition members inside. The Prime Minister's coalition of right-wing, religiously conservative, and ultranationalist parties stood steadfast. The Post report went on to say, quote, shortly before 4 p.m. local time, after opposition members had left the chamber in protest, government loyalists voted 64-0 in the 120-seat body to change Israel's basic law, stripping the Supreme Court of some of its powers of judicial review. It was the first victory in a more expansive plan to rein in the judiciary, which has long been a thorn in the side of Israel's right wing. At today's State Department briefing, spokesman Matt Miller talked about the White House's reaction to the vote.
With respect to the vote in the Knesset today, as we've said before, as a lifelong friend of Israel, President Biden has publicly and privately expressed his views that major changes in a democracy should be, if they're going to be enduring, must have as broad a consensus as possible. It was unfortunate that the vote today took place with the slimmest possible majority. We understand talks are ongoing and likely to continue over the coming weeks and months to forge a broader compromise, even with the Knesset in recess, and we will continue to support the efforts of President Herzog and other Israeli leaders as they seek to build a broader consensus through political dialogue.
Thousands of Israeli military reservists have said they would not report to work if the bill passed, and Israel's main labor union announced minutes after the vote that it is starting the process for a general strike in the country. Ukrainian officials are taking responsibility for a series of drone attacks over Moscow earlier today. An official from Ukraine's Ministry of Defense told CNN the agency was responsible for the operation and that there would be more strikes to come. The attacks come after Russian missile strikes hit the Ukrainian port city of Odessa over the weekend, killing at least one person and injuring 19 others. Russia claimed its targets were being used to prepare, quote, terrorist attacks. Here's more on that from Matt Miller.
Following its callous suspension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Russia is now subjecting the citizens of Odessa to their most intense series of barrages since the start of this war. Missile and drone strikes that began last week after Russia withdrew from the Black Sea Grain Initiative have killed and injured scores of civilians, devastated UNESCO-listed heritage sites, including the historic Orthodox Transfiguration Cathedral, and destroyed port infrastructure and grain stockpiles that could have fed hundreds of thousands around the world. Over the weekend, we saw appalling images of burning churches and flattened residential buildings. Today, Russia attacked grain warehouses on the Danube River, now a vital export route for grain since Russia has effectively blocked Black Sea ports. The United States strongly condemns Russia's escalatory attacks. The consequences for the rest of the world of Russia's attacks on Ukraine have never been more clear. These vicious strikes further illustrate Russia's willingness to use food as a weapon in its illegal war against Ukraine. The Kremlin wants to deprive Ukraine's economy of a major source of income without regard for needy people across the globe who will feel the consequences and be forced to pay higher prices for food. The United States and our allies and partners will not waver in our support for Ukraine as it defends itself and fights to reclaim its sovereign territory. We will continue to support Ukrainians as they work to recover and rebuild, as you saw from the nearly $1 billion in assistance announced during Administrator Power's travel to Odessa and Kyiv last week. While we seek to help Ukraine rebuild and find alternate ways to continue its grain exports to the world, the Kremlin remains determined to cause destruction. Until Russia withdraws its forces and demonstrates that it has an interest in peace, it is our shared responsibility to demand that the Kremlin cease its attacks on Ukraine and its people, to help Ukraine defend its territory and protect its people, and to hold Russia to account for the suffering it chooses to inflict on so many.
State Department spokesman Matt Miller at today's briefing. You can see all of his comments on the situation in Israel and the Russia-Ukraine war and the entire briefing from the State Department at cspan.org. Texas Governor Greg Abbott says he is prepared to go to court with the Biden administration over the floating barriers in a portion of the Rio Grande River. The statement comes the same day as the Justice Department's deadline to comply with its request to remove the barriers, saying their installation raises humanitarian concerns and violates the Federal Rivers and Harbors Act. The state installed the barriers last week. They cover 1,000 feet in the middle of the river near Eagle Pass, Texas, and have anchors in the riverbed. It's part of the governor's multi-billion Operation Lone Star border plan. In a letter to the president, Governor Abbott said in part, quote, "If you truly care about human life, you must begin enforcing federal immigration laws. By doing so, you can help me stop migrants from wagering their lives in the waters of the Rio Grande River. You can also help me save Texans, and indeed all Americans, from deadly drugs like fentanyl, cartel violence, and the horrors of human trafficking. To end the risk that migrants will be harmed crossing the border illegally, you must fully enforce the laws of the United States that prohibit illegal immigration between ports of entry. In the meantime, Texas will fully utilize its constitutional authority to deal with the crisis that you have caused. Texas will see you in court, Mr. President." At today's White House briefing, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre reacted to Governor Abbott's letter.
So I'm going to let the Department of Justice speak to this. They've been very clear last week that they also will see Governor Abbott in court for his unlawful actions. We've been very clear about that, and we have also said that when we move forward with a plan, right, a plan of deterrence, diplomacy, and also enforcement with how we were going to move forward after Title 42 was lifted, we actually saw the numbers go down. We actually saw the president's plan working. And what you see the governor doing is dangerous and unlawful, and it's actually hurting the process. It's hurting the process of what we're trying to do. And instead of wanting to, or undermining, I should say, instead of coming to the table and trying to figure out a way to work together, he continues to do this really cruel, unjust, inhumane ways of moving forward with a system that has been broken for decades. This is a president that has taken action from day one and has continued to show what he can do to help deal with the border situation. But Governor Abbott is not about that, and so the Department of Justice has been very clear. We've been very clear about that. They've been very clear about taking him to court about his unlawful actions. So I'm going to let them speak to it.
Thanks, Karine. You're talking about these unlawful actions, and the letter very clearly spells out all the ways in which the governor has broken the law. What is preventing the federal government from removing the river barriers? Why is this a legal matter?
Well, first I'm going to let the Department of Justice speak to this. And look, the governor's action is making it difficult to access the river, patrol the area. That's what he's doing. And arrest individuals who attempt to enter the country unlawfully. That's what his actions is actually preventing. And so those are unlawful. Those are unlawful actions that are not helpful and is undermining what the president has put forward and is trying to do. That's what we're seeing. But I'm going to let the Department of Justice speak to the legalese piece of this, and they will certainly speak more in detail about how they see themselves moving forward.
And I understand that, but I mean, if the barriers are, unlawfully there in the river, why not instruct the Army Corps of Engineers to move them?
I'm not going to speak to what's going to be instructed of the Army Corps engineers. What we're speaking to is the unlawful actions that the governor is taking and how the Department of Justice is going to move forward. Anything related to that, certainly I would refer you to Homeland Security specifically.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, you can see all of today's White House briefing at cspan.org. And late this afternoon, Politico reporting that the Department of Justice has sued the state of Texas and Governor Greg Abbott for building a floating barrier at the southern border that the state says will deter migrants, but that the Biden administration calls a threat to public safety. The lawsuit was filed in federal court in Austin, alleges that Abbott violated the law by building structures in the Rio Grande River without authorization, creating obstruction in U.S. waters. You can read more at Politico.com. Congress returns to work this week. The House will work on federal spending bills to fund the government into 2024. The Senate will continue work on the Defense Programs and Policy Bill, with a final vote expected by the end of the week. This is Congress's last week of legislative business ahead of the scheduled August recess, and current government funding is set to expire on September 30th. But according to House Homeland Security Committee Democrat Seth Magaziner of Rhode Island, some Republicans aren't concerned about that looming deadline.
Well, for some of the extreme members of the far right MAGA House Republicans, the shutdown is what they want. They want the chaos. They want the division. And they think that it'll make Joe Biden look bad and pave the way for a return of Donald Trump. And that's not what people elected us for. You know, the American people have rejected extremism in politics again and again and again. They rejected it last time when Republicans underperformed expectations. They certainly rejected extremism when Joe Biden beat Donald Trump. And so the American people want us to work together to support priorities that'll help working people. You know, in this upcoming spending debate, I want to be fighting for funding to help fund education and workforce training and bring back manufacturing jobs, building on the success of the Build Back Better agenda. Unfortunately, the Republicans in the House, the far right who have captured the House leadership, have all the wrong priorities. They just released spending bills that would gut education, that would cut more than 200,000 spots for public school teachers nationally, and 50,000 spots for early childhood education through Head Start, cutting funding for infrastructure, cutting funding for lead remediation. These are extreme priorities that they have. And at the same time, they're pushing yet another round of tax cuts for billionaires. So cutting programs for working people, pushing tax cuts for billionaires, those are all the wrong priorities. But of course, they are the priorities of the far right. And we're going to have a fight on our hands for sure. But we have the American people on our side. The American people are tired of the extremism. They're tired of the chaos and division that we've seen from the far right in the House this session. As our leader, Hakeem Jeffries in the House, says on the Democratic side, we are team normal. The House Republicans are team extreme, and that's why I'm confident that we will be successful at the end of the day.
Rhode Island Democrat Seth Magaziner speaking on MSNBC. With more on what's coming up this week on Capitol Hill, we talked to New York Times congressional reporter Luke Broadwater.
Let's start with the House first. What are some of the main issues that will come up this week?
Sure. Well, scheduling is a little bit in flux right now, but the main thing I'm watching for is whether the House Republicans can get two of their appropriations bills moving across the House floor. As you listeners probably know, Kevin McCarthy, one of his priorities has been to not just pass some big omnibus budget at the end of the year, but to pass these appropriation bills one by one, all 12 of them throughout the course of this Congress. This is a promise he made when he was attempting to become Speaker. It's something that the Republicans want to see happen, and so they might try to move two of these this week. We'll see whether those can get ready in time. But
which ones would they be this week, you think?
So one is agriculture, and the other one would be for military construction. And there will be sort of the culture war debates that we've been seeing in this Congress about, you know, whether abortion restrictions should be in there, DEI restrictions, things like that. But that's going to be the first two that they're going to try to move.
Well, doing it this way, you say potentially the first two this week, and he made the promise to get through all 12 individually. In doing this way, each time he exposes himself to the potential losing votes from his caucus on those pieces of legislation, correct?
Right, sure. Yeah. And this is a difficult task, right? Like, this doesn't often happen in Congress.
Right.
Congress has got into the habit of passing one huge omnibus at the end of the year. And I don't think anybody really believes it's going to be an easy task to get all 12 done. There's just not a ton of time. It takes a long time to get these bills. There's so many policies involved. But there is sort of a gun to the head of this Congress, right? Because in the debt limit deal, at the end of the year, there's a 1%, if they don't get these done, there'll be a 1% cut across government. All government spending will be cut by 1%. And none of the Republican policies would go into effect. They'd still be stuck with Nancy Pelosi's policies from the last Congress. So there's pressure on both sides. Democrats don't want the cut, and Republicans don't want the old Pelosi policies.
How about in the Senate? What's happening this week? And because I've read that it's potential they may not finish their work this week.
Yes. So they've got the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, and so every year this is one of those must-pass bills that has to go through Congress. And what it does is it really sets the roadmap for how the military can spend the money when it's appropriated for it. A version of this bill has already passed the House. That was I don't know if the threat word is bogged down, but all these extra provisions were added in on culture war issues, right?
Yeah.
Like banning the military from using diversity, DEI officers, basically defunding those positions or kicking those people out of their jobs. There's restriction on paying for military travel for abortions and a number of other issues. Those are things that the Democrats in the Senate don't want. They won't vote for those things. So we are headed eventually, if this does pass the Senate, for a conference committee, and that could be quite contentious as well, because Kevin McCarthy has already said that he wants to have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's one of the more far-right members of Congress, on that conference committee. So it could be very interesting to see how those negotiations go.
Tell us about the hold that Senator Tommy Tuberville has on military nominations and how this may come into play this week with the NDAA discussions.
Right. I mean, this is one of the probably the second biggest issue, if not the biggest issue right now that the Senate is encountering. I think it's close to 300 promotions or nominations in the military are being held up for admirals and generals by a single senator, Tommy Tuberville of Alabama. What Mr. Tuberville's objecting to is a policy that the Pentagon has put in place recently that would pay for travel, out-of-state travel, for abortions if a military service member wants to have an abortion. This comes in the wake of Roe versus Wade being overturned and differing state laws going into effect.
Right.
He says it violates the Hyde Amendment. It violates federal law that you can't pay for abortions, and paying for the travel is akin to paying for the abortion. But so he's put a hold essentially on all these promotions, and it's really angering the Democrats in the Senate tremendously. It's angering the Biden administration. They've started to say it's hurting the military at a deep level, but Tuberville is demanding that they change this policy or else he's going to keep the hold on it.
I saw that the Politico had a headline that Schumer's offered him a vote on the abortion issues amid the blockade in exchange for releasing his hold.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So Schumer's offering a vote on Tuberville's policy, which would not pass the Senate, right? So he would lose on that. But what Tuberville wants is a vote on the other side, so that they put forward proactively saying this is our policy, which also can't pass the Senate. So it's sort of a war of words right now and a war of strategies, and neither side seems like they're willing to.
But that language did pass in the House version, correct? Dealing with abortion in the military,
that's right.
Care for abortion.
Right, but it could not pass the Senate.
New York Times congressional reporter Luke Broadwater on today's Washington Journal. You can see all of this segment on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and at cspan.org/Washington Journal. On Wednesday, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas will appear before the House Judiciary Committee to answer questions on the agency's handling of the U.S. border and immigration enforcement. Also, the House Oversight and Accountability Committee will hold a hearing on unidentified aerial phenomenon, also known as UAPs. Witnesses are scheduled at that hearing to give firsthand accounts as the committee assesses the federal government's transparency on the issue and their potential threat to national security. And later, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell will hold a news conference following the Federal Open Market Committee meeting. You can find all the schedule information at cspan.org and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. And follow us on Twitter at C-SPAN Radio. You're listening to Washington Today.
Since 1979, in partnership with the cable industry, C-SPAN has provided complete coverage of the halls of Congress, from the House and Senate floors to congressional hearings, party briefings, and committee meetings. C-SPAN gives you a front row seat to how issues are debated and decided, with no commentary, no interruptions, and completely unfiltered. C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government.
Welcome back to Washington Today. Campaign 2024 news now. Former New Hampshire Republican Senator Kelly Ayotte announced she is running for governor of the Granite State.
You know, Governor Sununu did a great job, but there's going to be a vacuum there, and we are one election away from becoming Massachusetts in New Hampshire, and I'm not going to let that happen. We have something very special in New Hampshire. No income, no sales tax. Education freedom is so important in our state. So I'm running for governor to make sure that New Hampshire remains safe, prosperous, and free.
So when you say you don't want New Hampshire to become the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, what exactly evil are you talking about? It sounds like you're suggesting.
Oh, I can tell you what the evil is. It's the evil of an income tax, sales tax, less freedom. And here in New Hampshire, we take our state motto very seriously, live free or die. And there's just a very different perspective with our neighbors, and we need to stay the state that we are. We do have some issues that need to be addressed. I think the importance of public safety and fentanyl. We've had too many of our citizens dying of fentanyl, but we have a great state, and we're very different from our neighbors.
So picking up on what Governor Sununu did, and I believe would be 4 terms, what would your priorities be?
Number one priority is going to make sure that we're safe. And that means getting those fentanyl dealers. We need tougher penalties to get them off our streets. Unfortunately, we've seen drugs, the fentanyl being trafficked off our southern border from Lowell and Lawrence, Massachusetts, into our cities, and it's killing our citizens. We need to end the revolving door because we have a weak bail law that Democrats pushed that has allowed violent criminals to get back on our streets, and they continue to harm New Hampshire citizens. And we need to keep our economic advantage. Make sure that this is the best place to raise a family, but also to have a business. And that's what makes our state great.
Kelly Ayotte was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2010, but lost her 2016 re-election bid to Maggie Hassan, a Democrat. Before that, she was New Hampshire Attorney General. She made her announcement this morning on Fox and Friends. And a new Fox Business Network poll in Iowa shows South Carolina Senator Tim Scott slowly gaining on former President Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis there among Republican voters. Political Playbook writing today, quote, since launching his bid in May, Tim Scott's been on a slow but steady rise and has consistently notched the highest favorability ratings in the field. Senator Scott talked about his campaign's momentum to Fox Digital.
Hopefully the voters are hearing my message. Here's the good news. When you say, if you're able-bodied, you work. That works all across the Granite State. When you say if you take out a loan, you pay it back. People want to hear common sense, and common sense conservatism is the path to another American century. We're excited that the enthusiasm we're feeling on the ground is being reflected in the latest polls.
How do you get those numbers a little higher, though? How do you keep going in the right direction?
Keep doing what we're doing. It's working. So we have to continue to show up. We have to continue to have the resources to put on TV. You can go to votetimscott.com and join the movement.
Now, here are those Fox Business poll numbers. 46% of likely Republican caucus goers in Iowa say they support former President Trump. 16% support Ron DeSantis, with Tim Scott at 11%. The rest of the field is in single digits. A new USA Today Suffolk University poll in Ohio shows broad support for a constitutional amendment that guarantees abortion rights. A statewide special election on adopting the amendment is scheduled for August 8th. The poll found voters supported it 58% to 32%. There was significant support across party lines, with 81% of Democrats and 32% of Republicans surveyed saying they were in favor of the amendment. Nearly 66% of women voters and about half the male voters surveyed said they were in support. And nearly 70% of 18 to 34-year-old age voters surveyed said they were in favor. And in North Carolina, State Democratic Party Chair Anderson Clayton discussed her party's voter outreach efforts.
I don't think that we take a vote for granted in this election cycle. And my job as a state party chair, I think, is to do two things, right? Protect my incumbents and get out my base. And if I do both of those, Joe Biden does win an election in 2024, because we know that the 134,000 people that sat out for Sherry Beasley and the 74,000 people that sat out for Joe Biden were Democrats that sat home. And it's the same trend that we've seen happen in Florida, where Democrats, they get beat up every election cycle to the point where we feel like our votes don't matter anymore. And in North Carolina, when you've had such a history of voter suppression through racial gerrymandering in our state, it is hard to see how we can come around from that in people's minds, honestly, where voters have been to the ballot box every year and wanted to see change and voted for it. And we've seen that in the fact that we've been able to keep a Democratic governor and a Democratic attorney general, along with, Donald Trump on a ballot, right? North Carolina is not a monolithic state. And I think that we have to treat voters like that people are independent and they think on their own and they want to see what a candidate is going to really bring forward and offer them versus what a party has to give right now. Because I really think that folks are disenchanted with both parties. And that's part, in fact, because the parties have not done a good enough job, I think, and the Democratic Party especially, of getting out in places and showing people that we're there to listen to them. And the Democratic Party is the party of help, as it always should be.
North Carolina Democratic Party Chair Anderson Clayton speaking with Washington Post Live. She is the youngest state party chair in the country. You can see the whole discussion at cspan.org and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. That's also the place to go for more Campaign 2024 coverage, including announcements, meet and greets, speeches, and events. And it's also where you can find this program as a podcast. You can also get it wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And if you'd like more on the stories that are shaping Washington, subscribe to our evening newsletter, word for word. You can go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, our live forum involving you to discuss the latest issues in government, politics, and public policy from Washington, D.C. and across the country. Coming up Tuesday morning, financial services reporter Brendan Peterson of Punchbowl News previews this week's Federal Open Market Committee meetings and another potential interest rate hike. And then we'll talk with Adam Andrzejewski, founder of OpenTheBooks.com, about his research into waste and abuse in government spending. Also a discussion on climate change policies and recent extreme weather patterns with the Executive Director of Republic N, Bob Inglis, and David Kiva, President of the Environmental Defense Action Fund. C-SPAN's Washington Journal join in the conversation live at 7 Eastern Tuesday morning on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Now, or online at cspan.org.
Hear secretly recorded presidential phone calls to cabinet members, members of Congress, presidential staff, and even family members on C-SPAN's Presidential Recordings podcast. Season 1 features the calls of President Lyndon Johnson.
Well, your conclusion is A, he's the one that did it. B, the man he's after was the president. C, he would have hit him 3 times except the governor turned. I think that's correct. 4, that there's no connection between he and Ruby that you can detect now. And 5, whether he was connected with the Cuban operation with money you were trying to... That's what we're trying to nail down now.
Season 2 features President Richard Nixon.
He approved the bombing of Cambodia and Laos. He didn't, could not approve the renewing the bombing of North Vietnam. And I want you, if you will, to take a quick trip out to the hospital and say, Senator, brief him and say, we've got to hit in South Vietnam, just say that for a brief period. We've got to hit it in order to avoid a complete debacle.
Find C-SPAN's presidential recordings wherever you get your podcasts.